In today's video, we're gonna finish US 90 by covering Westbound. US 90 is 1,633 miles going through Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. At US 90's eastern beginning at Florida A1A, it has no control city, unfortunately. Although there is a sign before this saying Beach Boulevard at the next intersection, which is what US 90 is here. When we meet I-295, we're signed for Beach Boulevard. Here we meet I-95, signed north for 2 I-10, and we're now signed for downtown. We meet I-95 again not long after that, and we're now signed for Beaver Street. On the other side of Jacksonville, we go under I-295 without having an interchange with it, although there is a 2 I-295 sign up ahead. Here we meet I-10 and we're still signed for Beaver Street, although when you take that exit, we're now signed west for Baldwin. In Baldwin, we meet US 301 and we're now signed west for McClenny. In McClenny, we meet Florida 121 and we're now signed west for Glen St. Mary. In Glen St. Mary, we're now signed west for Lake City, which in actuality should have been signed from McClenny. When we meet I-10 again, we're now signed west for Alusty. Florida, just why? It's still faster to take US 90 to Lake City from here, so just continue signing it. Also, Alusty's unincorporated, like why are we signing this? In Lake City, we meet US 41 and we're now signed for Live Oak. US 90 also met US 441 before this intersection. On the mileage sign, Live Oak is the secondary in 23 miles and Tallahassee is the primary in 108. When we meet I-75, we're still signed west for Live Oak. Also, this interchange was requested by Matt Weebler. In Live Oak, we meet US 129 and we're now signed west for Madison. When we meet I-10, we're now signed west for Lee, which makes sense because taking I-10 is a faster way to Madison from here. I couldn't find anything in Lee, but anyways, in Madison we meet Florida 145 and are now signed for Greenville. In Greenville, we meet US 221 and we are now concurrent with it signed west for Monticello, which is for US 90. When US 221 leaves us, we're still signed west for Monticello. In Monticello, we meet US 19 and are now sensibly signed west for Tallahassee. At this interchange with I-10, we're still signed west for Tallahassee. Also, I-10 not having a control city here is kind of weird. I'd sign Pensacola here probably. Here we meet US 319 and instead of being signed for the next control city, we're actually signed for downtown instead, which is actually pretty good in my opinion. In downtown Tallahassee, we meet US 27 and we're now signed west for Florida State University in Quincy. On the other side of Tallahassee, we meet I-10 for like the gajillionth time already, but anyways, we're still signed west for Quincy. In Quincy, we meet Florida 267 and we're now signed west for Chattahoochee. On a mileage sign in Chattahoochee, Sneads is the secondary in 5 miles and Pensacola is the primary in 182. In Grand Ridge, we're now signed west for Mariana. In Mariana, we meet Florida 73 and we're now signed west for Cottondale. When we meet US 231 in Cottondale, we're now signed west for Chipley. This intersection was also requested by Dirtbog. In Chipley, we meet Florida 77 and are now signed west for Bonifay. In Bonifay, we meet Florida 79 and we're now signed west for Caryville. I couldn't find anything in Caryville nor Westville, which is signed for eastbound right here, but anyways, in Ponce de Leon, we're now signed west for Defuniak Springs. In Defuniak Springs, we meet US 331 and we're now concurrent with it signed west for Crestview, which is for US 90. When US 331 leaves us, it is signed north for Paxton, which is really provincial and is also right on the border with Alabama. This should probably be Florella. When we get to Crestview, we meet Florida 85 and we're now signed west for Milligan. In Milligan, we meet Florida 4 and we're now signed west for Holt. I couldn't find anything in Holt, but when we meet Florida 87, we're now signed west for Milton. When we meet Florida 281 just past Milton, we're now signed west for Pace, which despite how close we were to Pensacola actually still makes sense. When we meet I-10 in Pensacola, we're now signed west for Pensacola. When we meet I-110, we're now signed for Cervantes Street. This exit was also requested by Matt Weebler. Here we meet Florida 295 and we're now signed west for the Mobile Highway. We're now crossing over the Perdido Bay into Alabama. Why did Florida actually take so long? This video is already 4 minutes long, guys. There is literally nothing else in Alabama up until this point, but when we get here, we are now signed west for Loxley. There's also nothing signed in Loxley either, so when we meet I-10 in Daphne, we're now signed west for Spanish Fort along with US 98. While over the Mobile Bay, we meet I-10 yet again, and we're now signed for the Battleship Park and the Battleship Parkway. When we approach downtown Mobile, I-10 is first off signed for Pascagoula, signed Biloxi at Gulfport, not Pascagoula. Anyways, guys, we meet I-10 and we're now signed for Government Street. If you haven't seen it on the map yet, US 90 does some weird shenanigans in Mobile, so here we turn right and leave US 98 to do whatever this is. When we meet I-165, we're now about to run concurrent with it and we have no control city. At I-165 Southern Terminus, we're now signed west for 2 US 98. When we meet I-65, we're signed for Government Boulevard. When we meet I-10 for like the gajillionth time already, we're now signed west for Theodore. I couldn't find anything in Theodore, but when when we meet Alabama 188 in Grand Bay, we're now signed west for Pascagoula, which on US 90 is fine. It's time for Mississippi, guys. I don't know what to say. In Pascagoula, we now get signed west for Biloxi. When we reach Biloxi, we meet the southern terminus of I-110, and we're now signed west for Gulfport. In Gulfport, we meet the southern terminus of US 49, and we're now signed west for Long Beach. Mississippi, guys, not California. I couldn't find anything in Long Beach, but in Waveland, when we meet Mississippi 43 and 603, we're now signed west for New Orleans, shockingly, which for now I think is fine. Here we meet Mississippi 607, which will meet I-10 5 miles after this intersection, which will then take you to New Orleans faster. Because of that, we're now signed west for Pearlington, which is fine. We're now crossing over the Pearl River into Louisiana. Why was Mississippi, like, actually so short? When we meet US 11, we're still signed west for New Orleans. When we meet I-510, we're now signed for the Chef Mentor Highway, which makes sense because even though we've been in the New Orleans city limits the entire time, we're now in a more urban area. When we meet I-10, we're still signed for the Chef Mentor Highway. When we meet I-610, we get signed for New Orleans Street and North Broad Street. US 90 is now becoming Claiborne Avenue, but we meet US 90 Business, which is unsigned I-910, which is signed for the Mississippi River Bridge, and 2 I-10, which is what Baton Rouge is for. Also, just because why not, here's the interchange from above. Also, Matt Weber requested the I-10 interchange in New Orleans. At the other end of US 90 Business, we're now signed west for Raceland. This should be Houma and Thibodaux. The cities are like right next to each other, and both Houma and Thibodaux are larger than Raceland. Like, make this make sense. But at the end of I-310, we now get signed for Houma. So what on earth was the point of signing Raceland in the first place? What's even more strange is that in Raceland, we get signed west for Morgan City, completely skipping over both Houma and Thibodaux. Just sign Houma and Thibodaux first. Like, what is this? I'm so confused by this. This isn't making, like, any sense at all. Here we meet Louisiana 182, signed for Houma. This exit was requested by Adbrick Station because this is the exit they take going home from the east. Along with this reassurance shield, there's a future I-49 corridor sign, and on the topic of this, when and if this portion of US 90 from New Orleans to Lafayette becomes I-49, Houma and Thibodaux should be signed first, then Lafayette, but for now, Morgan City is fine to sign. Right after that, we get a mileage sign with Gibson in 4 miles as the secondary and Morgan City as the primary in 17. In Berwick, we meet Louisiana 182, and we're now signed west for Lafayette. Here we meet Louisiana 182 and 96, the Albertson Parkway and Saint-Nazaire Road. This exit was requested by the Times Are Here. In Lafayette, US 90 is now turning left, and we get signed west for Scott. I couldn't find anything in Scott, but when we meet Louisiana 724, we're now signed west for Rain. When we meet Louisiana 35 in Rain, we're now signed west for Crowley. In Crowley, we meet Louisiana 13, and we're now signed west for Jennings. On the mileage sign, Roanoke is our secondary in 3 miles, and Lake Charles is our primary in 28. So obviously other cities will be signed before getting to Lake Charles, but I couldn't find anything. But anyways, when we meet I-210, it's signed east for Lafayette. We're now about to run concurrently with I-10 in Lake Charles. When we leave I-10, we're now signed for Truesdale Road. This should be Sulphur. I don't know what Louisiana DOT is doing here, not gonna lie. In Sulphur, we meet Louisiana 27, and we're now signed west for Edgerly. I couldn't find anything in Edgerly, but when we meet Louisiana 109, we're now signed west for Toomey, which is a region in the parish, apparently. Just sign Beaumont. We're about to run concurrently with I-10. This is one of the most horrible things I've seen, like, ever, honestly. And when we meet I-10 right after that and run concurrent with it, we're now signed west for Beaumont, which should also be Houston if you didn't even know in the last clip, by the way. We're now crossing over the Sabine River into Texas, and here's the Texas State welcome sign. In Beaumont, we meet US 69, 96, and 287, and they're now running concurrently with us along with I-10 for Houston. When US 90 leaves all of those highways, we're now signed west for Liberty. I couldn't find anything in Liberty, but in Dayton, we meet Texas 146, and we're now sensibly signed west for Houston. In Houston, we meet I-10 and I-610 at the same time, and we're now running concurrently with I-10 signed west for downtown Houston, but for some reason, US 90 is unsigned here, like, why? When we meet I-69 and US 59 signed south for Victoria, we're now signed west for San Antonio. When we meet I-45 signed south for downtown Houston, we're still signed west for San Antonio. Also, if you didn't notice, US 90 is still unsigned. On the other side of Houston, we meet I-610 again, and US 90 is still unsigned, and we're still signed west for San Antonio. Between Houston and San Antonio, US 90 leaves I-10 multiple times. In my eastbound video, I failed to notice this, so instead of covering it in westbound only, I'll just be skipping it. Also, I will mention bunch of the control cities for this part at the end of the video, so just like remember that there's different control cities. In San Antonio, we meet I-410 and we're still signed west for San Antonio because we're not in downtown yet. When we meet I-37 and US 281, they're signed south for Corpus Christi and the Rio Grande Valley, while we are now signed for El Paso along with US 87. When US 90 leaves I-10 and US 87, it also meets I-35 at the same time, and we're now signed west for Del Rio. When we meet I-410 on the other side of San Antonio, we're still signed west for Del Rio. But of course, as soon as we leave San Antonio, Texas decides to stop signing Del Rio and now sign Hondo? Continue signing Del Rio. I don't know what we're doing, Texas DOT, I really don't. And the mileage sign even reflects this too. If Hondo has our primary in 22 miles, just sign Del Rio. In Hondo, our new control city is Uvalde in 39 miles. When we meet US 83 in Uvalde, we're now signed west for Bracketville. Just sign Del Rio already. It's not that hard. Y'all did it once, y'all can do it again. When we meet Texas 131, we're now signed west for Bracketville in a mile, and Del Rio in 32, which should have stayed as the control city the entire time. In Del Rio, we meet US 277, and we are now concurrent with it, signed for Sonora, which is for US 277. Here, US 377 just, randomly decides to spawn in because it feels like it, and it's now running concurrently with us. When US 90 leaves US 277 and 377, it just gets signed for nothing. Sign Alpine, not nothing. Immediately after that interchange, we get signed west for Comstock. It's unincorporated, just sign Alpine. On the mileage sign, Comstock is the only city on it in 27 miles. Just sign Alpine, please. When we meet Texas 163 in Comstock, we're now signed west for Sanderson, which is better, but still shouldn't be signed. Just sign Alpine. On the mileage sign, Langtry is our secondary in 28 miles, and Sanderson is our primary in 88. Once again, just sign Alpine. When we meet US 285 in Sanderson, we're now signed west for Marathon, which, yes, you do meet US 385 there, but still, just sign Alpine already. When we meet US 385, we're now concurrent with its sign still for Marathon for both highways and Big Bend National Park for US 385. When US 385 leaves us, all the control cities remain the same. And finally, after all of that, we're now finally signed for Alpine in 31 miles. While going towards Alpine, US 67 is now running concurrently with us, signed for Alpine. In Alpine, we meet Texas 118, and we're now signed for Marfa along with US 67 still. In Marfa, US 67 leaves us, and we're now signed west for Valentine. Just sign Van Horn. Valentine is ridiculously tiny. And because obviously I couldn't find anything in Valentine, when we get to Van Horn, we meet I-10 and US 90 ends. The control cities for Westbound should be Beach Boulevard, then Beaver Street when you meet I-95 the second time, then Baldwin when you meet I-10, then McClenny, Lake City, Dumptime, Glencoe, Marion, Lusty, then Live Oak, Madison, Lee when you meet I-10 after Live Oak, then Madison again after Lee, then Greenville, Monticello, Tallahassee, Quincy, Chattahoochee, Sneeds, Marion, Cottondale, Chipley, Bonifay, Caryville, Ponce de Leon, then the Phoenix Rings, Crestview, Milligan, Holtz, Milton, Pace, Pensacola, Cervantes Street when you meet I-110, then the Mobile Highway when you meet Florida 295, and Robertsdale when you meet US 90 alternate, then Loxley, Daphne, Spanish Fort, Battleship Parkway when you meet I-10 before downtown Mobile, but Government Street when you meet I-10 right after that last interchange, then Mobile, don't sign nothing when you're concurrent with I-165, and Government Boulevard when you meet I-65, then Theodore when you meet I-10, then Grand Bay, Pascagoula, Biloxi, Gulfport, Long Beach, Bay St. Louis, New Orleans because of Mississippi 607, then Burlington after meeting Mississippi 607, then Slidell, New Orleans when you meet US 190, then Chef Metzer Highway when you meet I-510, then North Broad Street when you meet I-610, then Claiborne Avenue when you meet I-10 in downtown New Orleans, then Homeland Thibodeau, don't sign Raceland, then Morgan City, then Lafayette. Also, when and if this part of US 90 becomes I-49, just skip Morgan City, then Scott, Brain, Crowley, Jennings, Welsh, Iowa, Lake Charles, Houston when you're concurrent with I-10 in Lake Charles, then Sulphur when you leave I-10, don't sign Trousdale Road, then Edgerly, Minton, Houston when you're concurrent with I-10 again, don't sign Toomey and Beaumont, then Liberty when leaving I-10 in Beaumont, then San Antonio, the other Texas cities in between San Antonio and Houston. I mentioned them anyways, even though I said I wasn't going to. Then El Paso when concurrent with I-10 in San Antonio, then Del Rio when leaving I-10 in San Antonio, don't sign Hondo, Uvalde, or Bracketville, Alpine, don't sign Comstock, Sanderson, and Marathon, then Marfa, and finally Van Horn, don't sign Valentine. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed today's video, please subscribe. I also have more videos on my channel where I cover more US highways, and I also cover interstates and state highways, and I also look into and review control cities. Anyways, see you guys next time. Bye!